All right, welcome. Today we are looking right under the hood of human psychology. We're skipping past all the pop culture myths, the daytime TV advice and the fictional crime dramas, to look at the actual empirical science of the mind. Think of this explainer as mapping out the blueprint of human behavior, where we'll examine the exact biological, psychological, and social mechanisms that make us who we are.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here's our agenda for today. We're hitting the science of psychology, the limits of intuition, the 3 levels of explanation, the great psychological debates, and we'll wrap it all up with the major schools of thought.
Kicking things off with Section 1, the science of psychology. Let's define the field and set up the strict protocols we use to decode human behavior.
So psychology is officially defined as the scientific study of mind and behavior, and I want you to really notice that word scientific. The psychology we're talking about today isn't some guru on TV giving advice to a family in crisis. Real psychology relies entirely on empirical methods. That means systematically collecting data, organizing it, and drawing completely objective conclusions. It is rooted in rigorous data collection, not just, someone's personal opinion.
So the crucial takeaway here is how the scientific method separates what we call values from facts. Values are basically personal statements. Like if I said, it's super important to study psychology, well, science can't actually prove or disprove that, right? Because it cannot be objectively measured. Facts, on the flip side, are objective statements that have been proven accurate through empirical study. For example, stating there were over 21,000 homicides in the US in a specific year. That's a hard, measurable fact. Without empirical research, we literally can't tell the difference between what just feels true and what actually is true. Moving right along to Section 2, the limits of intuition. Let's scan for some system errors and see why our everyday common sense is actually deeply flawed.
See, we humans have this massive cognitive glitch called the hindsight bias. It's the tendency to believe we could have predicted something that already happened, even when realistically there's no way we could have. Have you ever read a new research finding and instantly thought, well, duh, I knew that all along? It's literally the ultimate Monday morning quarterbacking. Just seeing the description of an outcome makes it feel incredibly obvious to us after the fact.
Let's look at a few specific examples that prove just how unreliable human observation is without hard science to back it up. In our daily lives, when an explanation just kind of feels right, we tend to adopt it as absolute truth and ignore everything else. Take eyewitnesses to violent crimes, for instance. Research actually shows they are often insanely confident when identifying a suspect, even when they're pointing at the completely wrong person. Or think about how people become convinced of the predictive power of astrology or extrasensory perception, despite literally zero empirical proof. The point is, our brains are incredibly good at tricking us.
Okay, Section 3, 3 levels of explanation. It's time to zoom in and look at the exact hardware and software layers driving human action.
Now, what's really interesting about this model is how it acts like a holographic blueprint for understanding human complexity. Notice those intersecting arrows? They show us that you can basically never explain behavior with just one single cause. Instead, we have these intersecting layers. Down at the bottom, we've got the biological level. In the middle, the psychological level. And at the top, the social-cultural level. All 3 overlap, and they are constantly amplifying and influencing each other.
Let's actually apply this to a real-world scan, like depression. If we look at the lowest biological level, we'd be investigating things like genetics and neurotransmitter imbalances in the brain, which, by the way, is exactly why drugs like Prozac can work. But if we move up to the middle, interpersonal layer, we're analyzing negative thought patterns and life experiences, and that is usually treated with therapy. Finally, scanning at the highest social-cultural level, we examine massive systemic issues, things like homelessness, abuse, discrimination. So you literally cannot fully understand or treat something as complex as depression without looking at all 3 of these levels at the exact same time.
All right, Section 4, the great psychological debates. Let's zoom back out to examine the massive, unresolved philosophical anomalies that still challenge the field today. We are talking about foundational programming theories that go all the way back to ancient Greece. On one side, you have Plato, arguing for nature, the idea that certain knowledge and traits are innate, you're just born with them. On the other side, Aristotle argues for nurture, the belief that we are completely blank slates when we're born, shaped exclusively by our environment, our learning, and our experiences. And the crazy thing is, even with modern brain imaging, psychologists today are still debating where nature ends and nurture begins.
And that brings us to a huge, really provocative question. Do you actually have free will? Or are your behaviors, your choices, even the thoughts you're having right at this exact second,
strictly determined by past events and your biological makeup. This debate over conscious control versus pure determinism is an absolutely massive cornerstone of psychological inquiry.
Moving into our final segment, Section 5, Schools of Thought. Let's do a quick scan through the timeline of psychology to see how the science evolved to answer these questions.
Let's move through this timeline and see how the field built upon itself. Psychology obviously started with philosophers, but in the late 1800s, it shifted into a laboratory science with structuralism and functionalism. Then, early 1900s, the psychodynamic and behaviorist schools took over. Jump to the 1960s, we get the cognitive revolution, which leads us right up to our modern social-cultural focus. As you'll see, each new school basically reacted directly to the blind spots and flaws of the one that came right before it.
So, the first major update was structuralism. Wilhelm Wundt and Edward Titchener had this incredibly ambitious goal. They wanted to create a literal periodic table of conscious sensations. They used a method called introspection, where they'd ask people to precisely describe their mental experiences during tasks, and they even measured reaction times with newly invented instruments. But, well, it completely failed. Why? Because people just couldn't accurately report on their unconscious processes. I mean, doing math is one thing, but explaining exactly how your brain did the math? Yeah, almost impossible.
Reacting to that failure, William James founded functionalism. Instead of trying to map the structure of the mind, he asked a better question. What does the mind actually do for our survival? He was heavily influenced by Charles Darwin's theory of natural selection, so functionalists believed our psychological traits evolved because they were, quite simply, useful. This was a brilliant shift, and it laid the exact groundwork for what we now call modern evolutionary psychology.
Next up is probably the one you're most familiar with, psychodynamics, championed by Sigmund Freud. Freud shifted the focus entirely away from conscious thought. He argued that human behavior is profoundly dictated by unconscious thoughts, repressed memories, and painful early childhood experiences that we don't even remember. And sure, while his specific methods are notoriously tough to test scientifically, Freud permanently established just how incredibly powerful the unconscious mind really is.
But then, the behaviorists enter the chat. Psychologists like John B. Watson and B.F. Skinner completely rejected introspection and the whole idea of an elusive unconscious mind. They argued that if psychology is going to be a real science, it has to focus only on what we can objectively observe: stimulus, response, and reinforcement. Behaviorists fall strictly on the nurture side of the debate. They controversially argued that free will is a total illusion and that we are literally nothing but complex products of our environmental conditioning.
And this brilliantly illustrates how the science evolves right alongside technology. In the 1960s, the invention of the electronic computer changed the game. Psychologists realized they could view the brain as an information processor, just like a computer that inputs, processes, and retrieves data. This birthed cognitive psychology, the study of mental processes like perception, thinking, memory, and judgment. Combined with modern neuroimaging techniques that literally let us watch the brain light up in real time, this school is still enormously influential today.
Tracing this massive timeline of psychological pioneers brings us right up to the modern era and our final major school, social cultural psychology. So after mapping the brain, the unconscious, and observable behavior, scientists realized they had to look at the absolute highest level of explanation. This school looks at how the social situations and specific cultures we live in ultimately dictate our thinking and behavior. Basically, you just cannot understand the individual without understanding the society they operate in.
So, as we wrap up this explainer today, I'm turning the question directly to you. Think about a recent decision you made. Was it driven by your biology and genetics? Was it a product of your environment and behaviorist conditioning? Or was it heavily influenced by your social-cultural surroundings? Which level best explains your own behavior today? Keep that question in mind as you go about your day. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the world around you.